Yoga, Past, Present, and Future by Bob Smith. Introduction. Throughout its history, yoga has presented a path aimed at leading the aspirant away from ignorance and toward the light of knowledge and truth. In this article, we will take a look at the 10,000-year history of yoga, as well as focus on its most recent past. What is this yoga that has spread like wildfire across the West and across the world over the last 5 decades? What are the roots of yoga? Is there an evolutionary yoga that will guide us through the turbulent times we presently find ourselves in? To help answer these questions, let us first turn to a writing piece of Professor Rae Heimbeck, 1930 to 2016. The foreword to the book I wrote in 1980, Yoga for a New Age, a Modern Approach to Hatha Yoga. Yoga Through the Ages by Rayburn S. Heimbeck. Whether or not an Aquarian age is dawning for the world at large, yoga today is experiencing a rebirth. Yoga has found itself immersed in a powerful new matrix of transformation. But then, yoga is no stranger to change. For even a quick glance at its complex history reveals that it always has been a growing, organic thing, branching out, adapting to new environments, surrendering to pruning and reshaping, never static, and at no point finalized in form. The fecundity of yoga through the ages could be anticipated from the term itself. The Sanskrit word yoga, as is well known, means union, although reunion is closer to actual usages. Reunion implies reconnection of factors earlier joined but subsequently separated. The Asian word, therefore, in meaning, resembles the European word religion, which according to its Latin roots signifies that which binds back together again. The comparison is apt, for yoga in Asia has been used to name just about every sort of religious practice known to man. The richness of the term, then, is matched by the astonishing diversity of practices and beliefs with which yoga has been associated. Through 25 centuries of religious experiments and innovations, yoga in India, connected there with the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, came to include mind-altering meditation, chanting of sacred sounds, mantras, ascetic austerities, devotional study of revealed scripture, disinterested performance of daily work, ritualistic worship, channeling of mystic energy up the spine, ecstatic sexuality, actions patterned on geometrical patterns, mandalas, bizarre bodily purifications, dietary observances, exotic bodily postures, breathing exercises, and more, to list them in sequence from appearance from about 500 before current era to 1000 current era. From this itemization, it is apparent that yoga practice through the ages has been manifold rather than monolithic. The same must be said of yoga belief. Practice and philosophy have traveled the path of yoga history together, equaling one another in variety. Take, for example, the spectrum of philosophical goals projected in justification of yogic practice. Union with an impersonal absolute, union with a personal deity incarnated in earthly form, union with the body of a cosmic male-female polarity, physical immortality on earth, and evolution of supermind on earth, to mention only the most noteworthy. This array of philosophical goals can be streamlined by reduction to two broad categories: those goals pertaining to transcendence of the embodied state, and those proposing to transmute it. In short, the otherworldly and this worldly. Such reduction notwithstanding, however, yoga philosophy through the ages, like practice, has been many rather than one. End quote. A glance into the historical development of yoga. To get some perspective on what yoga is, let us take a look at the 10,000-year history of yoga in India. Vedic period. The Vedic period of the subcontinent of India is said to have persisted from approximately 5000 BCE until around 500 BCE, although it would be more accurate to say that Vedic yoga began closer to 10,000 BCE. At the onset of the Vedic age, yoga was founded by unnamed rishis as the truth of the ages became revealed to them. The revealed knowledge of Vedic yoga was organized into four main texts that guided the development of the Indian civilization for a long while. For more than 4,000 years, probably closer to 9,000 years, the Vedas were orally transmitted from generation to generation. Eventually the Vedas were written down, somewhere around 1500 BCE. The four main Vedic texts are the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, and the Atharva Veda. In these books, the main commentary is upon the nature of Brahman, God, and how Brahman manifests this universe. The actions prescribed for followers were given in poetic formulas and slokas, to be performed as rituals, yajnas. The rituals themselves became the spiritual practices of the Vedas. However, a better understanding of the meaning of the rituals eventually was required, as these texts were written in a highly symbolic language that was difficult to decipher for the common person. The Brahmanas. A shift in religious beliefs and practices can be discovered between the early and late portions of the Vedas. The Brahmanas, composed orally from approximately 1200 to 700 BCE, featured and described a pantheon of many gods and goddesses that together form the Godhead of the one God. The Brahmanas preserved the Vedic rituals as much as possible, and out of this time period a group of priests, Brahmins, were born. Out of the Brahmanas came a vast array of stories about the many gods and goddesses, as an attempt to make the gods and goddesses accessible to the common person in the form of personal deities became the emphasis. The priestly caste helped to serve as intermediaries between humans and the gods and goddesses, and to help interpret the stories. There was quite an anthropomorphic twist to the tales of the gods and the goddesses, and in time, something essential of the Vedic vision seemed to be lost, and a new direction was needed. The Upanishadic text came as a response. The Upanishads. The Upanishads, belonging to the period 700 to 100 BCE, conclude the Vedas and enjoin union with one mysterious force. The authors of the Upanishadic text were rishis who went into the forest and did a lot of tapasya, spiritual discipline, in order to reach exalted states of awareness. These rishis experienced the Vedic teachings. However, they encased their experiences in a language that was intuitive rather than formulaic. In one go, they swept away all the rituals and aimed at the direct awakening of consciousness. In the Upanishads, a hierarchy of consciousness was developed, and to this very day, all the main schools of Indian spiritual philosophy, including yoga, use this hierarchy of consciousness to explain life. It was a teaching that was passed on intimately from one teacher to just a few students. The powerful stories of the Upanishadic texts alone could awaken a direct experience of oneness. The traditional number of Upanishads is said to be 108, and there are 13 main ones, chronologically beginning with the Isha, Kena, and Katha Upanishads. As the schools of thought arising out of the Upanishads became many, they quarreled and bickered, and so quite naturally, out of this milieu, there came the next great synthesis, the Bhagavad Gita, where devotion to Lord Krishna and work in the everyday world was emphasized. The Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita has received more acclaim from readers and more attention from commentators than any other Indian classic. A slender text of 700 verses in 18 short chapters, it became incorporated into the Indian psyche more than 2 millennia ago as a part of the colossal Indian epic, the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is a mythical tale of ancient India, though it may be more than a myth. At the apex of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita. The entirety of the story of the Bhagavad Gita takes place on a battlefield, where the two sides, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, are poised to wage war with each other. Moments before the actual fighting is about to begin, Arjuna, the great warrior leader of the Pandavas, has a breakdown and tells Sri Krishna that he cannot fight. Sri Krishna admonishes Arjuna for not fighting, telling him that it is his time to fight, that he must fight. In a very dramatic way, Lord Krishna reveals his true nature to Arjuna and the notion of the immanent divine. After a timeless moment, Arjuna wakes up from Sri Krishna's soliloquy and leads the Pandavas into the battle. Although the Pandavas win the war, it is left in doubt whether the Dharma will prevail in the next epoch of human life or not. Dharma is the cosmic order and the cosmic law of this order. A Dharma is that which pits itself against the cosmic order and the cosmic law. Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that when freedom's way is seriously threatened by the forces of darkness and ignorance, that sometimes the aspirant must fight with everything within their means to try to preserve the Dharma. And whether the battle is won or lost, the battle must be fought. The Bhagavad Gita brings clarity to the notions of Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. The Yoga Sutras. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are another milestone in the development of Indian yoga, and is the definitive text on Raja Yoga and meditation. Nothing of historical certainty is known about Patanjali the man, with estimates ranging from the 3rd century BCE to the 5th century current era as to when the Yoga Sutras were written. Patanjali's originality is to be found mostly in the masterful way he assembled and shaped materials borrowed from older texts. He took his theory of yogic consciousness from the Upanishads. Patanjali is credited with giving the meditative practices found in earlier texts their permanent strategic order: posture, breath control, sense withdrawal, concentration, and contemplation. Here we have the first reference to asana as having relevance, as particular meditation postures can aim the practitioner toward the goal of yoga. The asana mentioned in the Yoga Sutras only describes the right kind of seated position for meditative purposes. Patanjali proposed 2 stages to the yoga process. First, to deactivate the physical organism in which thought waves were produced. Secondly, Once the thought waves of consciousness were emancipated from the psychological organism, then the spiritual principle upon which all rests could shine with all its luminosity, and the practitioner could reach the goal of yoga. Middle Ages, 500 through 1500 current era. The Middle Ages saw the development of many satellite traditions of yoga in India. Tantra Yoga and Hatha Yoga are two of the more prominent yoga paths that emerged out of this time period. Tantra Yoga. Tantra is a range of esoteric traditions that began its rise in India around the 5th century current era. Tantra made an abrupt turn away from the ascetic practices of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Yoga Sutras, where detachment from the world was emphasized, as Tantra aimed at confronting, shaping, and mastering life's circumstances. Yoga historian George Feuerstein writes, "The scope of topics discussed in the Tantras is considerable. The Tantric yogis deal with the creation and history of the world, the names and functions of a great variety of male and female deities, ritual worship, especially of goddesses, ritual magic and sorcery, esoteric physiology, the mapping of the subtle or psychic body, the awakening of the mysterious serpent power, Kundalini Shakti, techniques of bodily and mental purifications, the nature of enlightenment, and not least, sacred sexuality." In Chapter 5, The Synthesis of Systems, of The Synthesis of Yoga, Sri Aurobindo writes, "Tantra expressly differentiates itself from the Vedic methods of yoga. In all the Vedic methods, the lord of the yoga is the Purusha, the conscious soul that knows, observes, attracts, governs. But in Tantra, it is rather Prakriti, the nature soul, the energy, the will in power, executive in the universe. It was by learning and applying the intimate secrets of this will in power, its method, its Tantra, that the Tantric yogin pursued the aims of his discipline: mastery, perfection, liberation, beatitude. Instead of drawing back from manifested nature and its difficulties, he confronted them, seized, and conquered. We have in this central tantric conception one side of the truth, the worship of the energy, the Shakti, as the sole effective force for all attainment. We get the other extreme in the Vedantic conception of the Shakti as a power of illusion, and in the search after the silent, inactive Purusha as the means of liberation from the deceptions created by the active energy. But in the integral conception, the conscious soul is the Lord, the nature soul is his executive energy." Hatha Yoga. Roughly around the 11th century, certain techniques associated with Hatha Yoga began to be outlined in a series of early texts. The aims of these practices were siddhis, supranormal powers, and mukti, liberation. In the 15th century, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika was composed as a compilation of the earlier Hatha Yoga texts. Hatha Yoga was viewed as a preparatory stage of physical purification to set the stage for a higher consciousness to enter during meditation. In the 15th century, Hatha Yoga represented a trend towards the democratization of yoga insights and religion. It eliminated the need for either ascetic renunciation or priestly intermediaries, ritual paraphernalia, and initiations. This led to its broad historic popularity in India. Later, in the 20th century, this disconnect of Hatha Yoga from certain of its underlying spiritual aspects, along with the democratic access of Hatha Yoga to one and all, enabled it to spread worldwide. Yoga in the modern times. Yoga comes to the West. Swami Vivekananda. As we have seen for more than 7,000 years, the term yoga has encompassed many things, most of these having to do with the spiritual realms and practices leading toward God realization. In the mid to latter part of the 19th century, yoga came to the attention of Westerners, who at the time seemed intrigued by Indian culture. We can attribute yoga's introduction to the West to Swami Vivekananda, 1863 to 1902, a Vedantic yogi who toured Europe and the US in the 1890s to spread knowledge about yoga and Vedanta to the West. Swami Vivekananda was the first person to bring yoga to America, and his speech at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893 opened the door for yoga to come to America. He was a Raja Yoga master who had studied under the highly influential Indian guru Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, 1836 to 1886. After his speech at the religious conference in Chicago in 1893, Swami Vivekananda formed the Vedanta Society of New York and lectured in various cities on the East Coast and central United States for more than 2 years. After he returned to India from this tour, there was not any significant development of yoga in the U.S. until 25 years later, with the coming of Paramahansa Yogananda. Yoga in the U.S. in the 1920s. Paramahansa Yogananda. Paramahansa Yogananda, 1893 to 1952, was given the task by his guru, Sri Yukteswar, to come to America and relay the message of yoga to the West. He came to the United States in 1920 and spread his brand of Kriya Yoga across America for more than 3 decades. His book, Autobiography of a Yogi, remains a yoga classic and has become the most popular book on yoga ever written. Yogananda was the first major Indian teacher to settle in the USA and was dubbed the, quote, 20th century's first superstar guru by the Los Angeles Times. Arriving in Boston in 1920, he embarked on a successful transcontinental speaking tour before settling in Los Angeles in 1925. For the next 2.5 decades, he gained a local fame as well as expanded his influence worldwide. He created a monastic order, the Self-Realization Fellowship, went on many teaching tours, bought properties for his organization in various California locales, and initiated thousands into the system of yoga he named Kriya Yoga. Yogananda faced many challenges while living in the U.S., as there was no precedent set for what he was intending to do. It was a path of self-realization, of God realization that he sought to bring forward, and it was a tough sell, as the Vedantic philosophy ran against the grain of the rugged individualistic philosophy of the West and the materialistically oriented culture of the U.S. Along with many huge successes, there were countless numbers of difficult trials and tribulations and failures for him, and for his devotees, and for the organizations that surrounded him. He relayed a synthesized combination of Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga, and branded it under the name of Kriya Yoga. Autobiography of a Yogi has been translated into over 50 languages and has had a huge impact upon the lives of countless millions of people around the world. There is also a very inspiring documentary movie about him entitled Awake, The Life of Yogananda, and is filled with video footage of him in the US and in India. The worldwide influence of T. Krishnamacharya. Tirumalai Krishnamacharya, 1888 to 1989, is widely regarded as one of the main influences of the 20th century yoga that came to the West, emphasizing asana practice, not God realization. Yoga as exercise, of the type seen and practiced in the West, was greatly influenced by T. Krishnamacharya, who taught from 1924 until his death in 1989. He combined asanas from Hatha Yoga with gymnastic exercises from the physical culture of the time, and developed a style of asana practice that placed little or no emphasis on Hatha Yoga's spiritual goals and de-emphasized the underlying philosophy of yoga. Among his primary students were Pattabhi Jois, BKS Iyengar, Indra Devi, and T. Krishnamacharya's son, T.K.V. Desikachar. In the 1930s, he developed his system of Hatha Yoga in Mysore, India, as he was given the wing of a nearby palace to develop an independent yoga institution, which opened in 1933. Krishnamacharya's pupils at the time were primarily active young boys, and his students gave showy demonstrations at the palace to please the Maharaja and for funding. It was not just yoga asanas that were demonstrated, as he drew on many disciplines, including yoga, gymnastics, and Indian wrestling, to develop asana sequences aimed at putting on a good show. Eventually, Krishnamacharya standardized the pose sequences into 3 series, consisting of primary series, intermediate series, and advanced series. Students were grouped in order of experience and ability, mastering each sequence before advancing to the next. There will be more written about Krishnamacharya's primary, intermediate, and advanced series later when we discuss the influence of Pattabhi Jois upon asana practice in the West. Funding for the Mysore Palace ended by the mid-1940s, and Krishnamacharya moved to Madras, India, in the 1950s, where he continued to refine his yoga and Ayurvedic practices. He was also known as an Ayurvedic-based healer who helped many people with his knowledge and practice of Ayurvedic medicine. Krishnamacharya-linked schools have become widely known in the Western world. He lived to be 101 years old and died in Chennai, India, in 1989. Timeline of yoga gurus coming to the United States. Immigration ban on Indians, 1924 to 1965. In 1924, the United States Immigration Service imposed a quota on Indian immigration, making it difficult for any Indian sage to travel to America. From 1924 to 1965, there were very few Indian yoga teachers who made it into the U.S., and yoga did not make much progress on American soil during this time, except for the exceptional work of Paramahansa Yogananda. Yoga in the USA in the 1950s. Indra Devi. In 1948, Indra Devi, 1899 to 2002, opened a yoga studio in Hollywood, California, and taught yoga throughout the U.S. in the 1950s and in many places of the world throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. She was the first Westerner to study with the famous T. Krishnamacharya, and the first to bring his lineage to the West. Unlike BKS Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois, however, Indra Devi brought a more mature expression of asana practice to her yoga instruction. Indra Devi was a major force in the yoga world from the 1940s until her death in 2002. She brought forward her own style of asana practice and made an attempt to bring forward the deeper philosophical and spiritual teachings of yoga. Seattle's famed yoga teacher, Marie Swoboda, studied with Indra Devi in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s, and Marie became my asana instructor in the early 1970s. Yoga in the USA in the 1960s. America removes Indian immigration ban. A 1965 revision of U.S. law removed the 1924 quota on Indian immigration, opening American shores to a new wave of Eastern spiritual teachers. This was the key change made in the immigration laws that allowed yoga to infiltrate onto American soil. Swami Vivekananda, 1927 to 1993. Swami Vivekananda's book, The Complete Illustrated Book of Yoga, written in 1960, became an essential guidebook for American Hatha Yoga practitioners in the late 1960s and 70s, including myself. He founded numerous Shivananda yoga centers in Canada and the US in the 1970s and 1980s. Though his focus was primarily on the asana practice of Hatha Yoga, he relayed more than asana practice, as his Indian guru Shivananda Saraswati, 1887 to 1963, was a physician and a proponent of the broad spiritual teachings of Vedanta. Transcendental meditation spreads across America. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, 1916 to 2008, brought his version of meditation to America in the late 1960s and the 1970s. He was a Vedantist who simplified the Vedantic teachings into a simple, accessible formula of meditation that he called Transcendental Meditation. He created many TM centers throughout the Western world and a university dedicated to the study of yoga, meditation, and Vedanta in Iowa, U.S. In 1960, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi predicted that if 1% of a population would practice transcendental meditation, then the quality of life for the entire community would measurably improve. This has been statistically confirmed by 13 studies done in 24 U.S. cities with populations over 10,000, as well as in studies done in other countries. Baba Ram Dass. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Baba Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, 1931 to 2019, became the Pied Piper for American youth who were interested in yoga and Indian spirituality. The former Harvard professor left on a pilgrimage to India in 1967 and returned with a new identity, Ram Dass. His 1970 tour of college campuses and his book, Be Here Now, established the spiritual quest as a lifestyle for a new generation of seekers. More on Ram Dass later. BKS Iyengar, 1918 to 2014. In 1966, BKS Iyengar's book, Light on Yoga, was published in the United States, a book that has influenced every Western teacher of asana practice. Iyengar Yoga began to spread rapidly across the U.S. in the mid-1970s and has continued to grow for decades, even to this present day. Iyengar emphasized Hatha Yoga practice like no other before him had. Iyengar's book, Light on Yoga, has gone on to become the most widely read asana book ever written, and his reign on top as the most influential asana teacher anywhere, lasted for many decades. He was a harsh disciplinarian who changed the way in which Hatha Yoga was practiced in the West and throughout the world. Swami Rama. Swami Rama, 1925 to 1996, amazed researchers at the prestigious Menninger Foundation in 1970 when tests showed that he could control his autonomic nervous system, functions including heartbeat, pulse, and skin temperature. Swami Rama founded the Himalayan Institute in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, and this became an important research center for yoga in the West. Swami Satchidananda. Swami Satchidananda, 1914 to 2002, opened the Woodstock Festival in 1969 and became a popular guru figure for the hippies. He founded Integral Yoga Institute in rural Virginia, with branches later opening worldwide. Yoga in the U.S. in the 1970s. Pattabhi Jois. In 1975, Pattabhi Jois, 1915 to 2009, made his first visit to the United States and set off the wildfire of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. It was in the 1980s and 90s that his rigorous style of asana practice spread across the U.S., and it has continued to do so for many decades now. He led massive numbers of Westerners into practicing a rigorous style of Hatha Yoga that was very athletic in its form. Ashtanga Yoga took a turn toward what was called Power Yoga in the 2000s, and it is this offshoot of Power Yoga that is practiced and remains popular to this very day. T.K.V. Desikachar. In the mid-70s, T.K.V. Desikachar, 1938 to 2016, son of the great master T. Krishnamacharya, brought his Vinaya form to the West. T.K.V. Desikachar continues to have influence upon the Western yoga scene to this very day. He brought a more mature form of his father's yoga instruction forward as he studied yoga with his father after the family had moved from Mysore to Madras, and Krishnamacharya had moved on to focusing more upon one-to-one transmission. Baba Ram Das, the most popular American yoga guru of the 1970s. In the U.S., the vast majority of the big-name yoga teachers in the 1970s, Indra Devi, Swami Devananda, BKS Iyengar, Swami Satchidananda, and Pattabhi Jois, were all, more or less, Hatha Yoga instructors who emphasized asana practice as the main focus for their followers. Each of these teachers brought in their own personal version of yoga. It must be emphasized that the most popular yoga guru for the American youth throughout the 1970s was Baba Ram Das. He did not teach asana nor pranayama, as he was steeped in a devotionally based system of yoga, bhakti yoga, as well as a service-based system of yoga, karma yoga. How I came to yoga. In 1969, the Selective Service System of the United States conducted 2 lotteries to determine the order of call to military service for the Vietnam War for American men born from 1944 to 1950. My day of birth, August 25th, 1948, happened to come up as a high number. It meant I no longer had to go to college to receive a college deferment to avoid being drafted into military service for the Vietnam War. I dropped out of the University of Washington and became a hippie dropout. In my free time, I studied Eastern philosophies, among other things. I went to see many of the Indian yoga gurus who came through Seattle to give talks on yoga, and I was mesmerized by certain of them, including Ramdas, Richard Alpert, Swami Satchidananda, Yogi Bhajan, Swami Muktananda, and Pir Vilayat Khan, to name a few. I became a dedicated practitioner of yoga, as well as a student of Sufism, as relayed by Pir Vilayat Khan. Marie Svoboda became my main teacher. Marie Svoboda, the undisputed yoga queen of Seattle. Marie Svoboda, 1920 to 2012, was the only yoga teacher to have a yoga studio in the Seattle area from the late 1960s until 1977. From the time she opened her studio on the top of Queen Anne Hill in 1969 through the late 1990s, Marie was the hub of the yoga scene in Seattle. For this 30-year period, she was recognized by one and all to be the undisputed yoga queen of Seattle. She created her own unique style of asana practice that was highly eclectic. Her main background had been as a ballerina and ballet dance teacher in Prague, Czechoslovakia, presently named the Czech Republic. Along with her two daughters and husband, she moved from Prague to the east coast of the U.S. in the late 1940s, when Russia seized control of Czechoslovakia. After being introduced to yoga by Indra Devi in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s, she eventually decided to move to Seattle and open a yoga studio. She dedicated herself to bringing forward sound principles of movement into the way asana was taught. She taught pranayama and meditation. She taught that body awareness should be brought forward into as many circumstances as possible. She taught how to walk, sit, sleep, breathe, move, practice asana, concentrate, contemplate, and meditate. She brought forward yoga as a way of life. The three most popular yoga gurus in the West, 1980 to 2020. Humanity evolves, and yoga evolves, and the message of yoga must constantly be adapted and reshaped to fit the needs of the culture. The three biggest names of the Western yoga scene from 1980 through 2020 were BKS Iyengar, Pattabhi Jois, and Bikram Choudhury. What was the yoga that they brought forward? In 1980, my teacher, Marie Svoboda, went to Pune, India, to get first-hand experience of the instruction of BKS Iyengar. She came away in shocked disbelief about the ongoing physical and emotional abuse he dished out to his students. After studying with him for 3 weeks at his ashram in Pune, she returned to Seattle and told me he should not be teaching yoga in the public arena. Before going to India to study with him directly, from the mid-1970s to 1980, Marie had invited a dozen or more of the top San Francisco area Iyengar yoga teachers to her yoga studio to lead weekend yoga workshops. It turned out that no matter who the teacher was, the result was always the same. These Iyengar-based workshops were led by teachers who seemed to take pride in breaking down the ego of their students through slapping and shaming, and by forcing students to hold postures for such long periods of time that, inevitably, huge breakdowns occurred amongst many workshop attendees. The Iyengar-certified teachers prided themselves on certain alignment principles that had been brought forward by their teacher, and yet Marie, who thoroughly and completely understood body mechanics, vehemently disagreed with certain of his alignment propositions. The combination of a huge amount of arrogance exuding from the Iyengar teachers, the holding of poses for too long, the holding of dangerous poses for too long, and the ill-mannered and abusive teaching methods made for a bad combination. There have been more physical injuries that have occurred by students of Iyengar Yoga than through any other system of Hatha Yoga, by far. The psychological damages incurred by students of BKS Iyengar and Iyengar certified teachers cannot be calculated. I had many run-ins with Iyengar yoga teachers and decided to separate myself from the Iyengar style of Hatha Yoga in the early 1980s. Pattabhi Jois became known in the U.S. in the mid-1980s and continued to have a large following throughout the 1990s and 2000s. He called his system Ashtanga Yoga, and in it he condensed all the possible postures into 3 routines: the primary series, the intermediate series, and the advanced series. Pattabhi Jois, a devout follower of Krishnamacharya, brought forward the exact sequencing that he was taught in the 1930s by his guru, the same gymnastically oriented asana routines designed for young boys at the Mysore Palace. From my perspective, the whole progression was and is poorly constructed from the beginning to the end, and certainly it is not suited for Western practitioners of yoga. The Ashtanga Yoga practice, as taught by Pattabhi Jois, led to nothing but injuries. One by one, dozens of his students looked me up at the yoga studio I opened in 1980, the Hatha Yoga Center of Seattle, as they were seeking advice on how to practice asana in a way in which they did not continue to injure themselves. In particular, the progression was hazardous to the shoulder joints. However, the injuries that I bore witness to covered a wide range throughout the entire body. On another note, in recent years, it has come to light that Pattabhi Jois inappropriately touched many of his female students while adjusting them in asana practice. Pattabhi Jois's reputation has been severely tarnished in these accusations. Most certainly, the teaching techniques of BKS Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois did not come out of a void, as Krishnamacharya was their teacher. Here's a quote from an article entitled T. Krishnamacharya from wikipedia.com. Quote, Krishnamacharya, unlike earlier yoga gurus, severely criticized his students, including his young brother-in-law, BKS Iyengar. He was equally bad-tempered at home with his family. In the view of the historian of yoga, Elliot Goldberg, Iyengar would never recover from or anywhere near comprehend the damage inflicted on him by Krishnamacharya's abuse during his teenage years. T. Krishnamacharya passed on a teaching style that included severe criticism, harsh instruction, and he had a bad temper to boot. The Iyengar certified yoga instructors whom I studied with in the late 1970s and early 1980s on the west coast of the USA all had big egos. When I walked away from the Iyengar yoga scene in the early 1980s, I was relieved and never looked back. The Iyengar system of Hatha Yoga has gone through many changes in the last 40 years, but it has remained problematic in my eyes. This because of the extreme arrogance held by so many of the Iyengar certified yoga teachers, along with their punitive way of instructing. There is much that needs to be repaired from all this, and in time it will. Bikram Choudhury turned the yoga world upside down by franchising his 26 postural flow into something he called hot yoga. He flaunted his apparent success with an enormous ego. Many lawsuits followed him around wherever he went. It turns out that the 26 postures he claimed that he was the creator of were not his to claim. He lived the high life in Hollywood with dozens of Rolls Royces and with lots of controversy. It turns out that he was a liar, a scoundrel, and a sexual predator. In November of 2017, Bikram Choudhury Yoga filed for bankruptcy as the corporation of Bikram Yoga faced more than 16 million in legal judgments, as well as numerous allegations of sexual harassment and assault against Bikram Choudhury. He fled the U.S. to avoid prison for the sexual assault charges and escaped with bunches of money. He continues to teach in Europe and other places around the world to this very day. There is a very revealing Netflix documentary about Bikram entitled Bikram, Yogi, Guru, Predator. The film revealed that he was a pathological liar. It was a dark, asuric force that he brought into the American yoga scene. Yoga spreads across the world 1980 to 2020. It must be noted that asana practice is a very small tip of the broad spectrum of yoga. An argument could be made that the only way yoga could possibly have taken hold in the West was through a yoga that aimed at physical fitness and the enhancement of the ego, rather than one that was too deep or reflective, a yoga that aimed at health benefits and stress management, rather than spiritual practices. In its transmission to the West as asana practice, most of the essential principles of yoga were minimalized, trivialized, and de-emphasized. However, it is also safe to say that the bedrock of truth upon which yoga has always stood still remains. Yoga has made its mark upon the world, and even if it is just a beginning step into asana practice, still, the number of people practicing yoga has grown by an astonishing rate from 1980 to the present time. Yoga has made a swift and massive migration across the world in the last 4 decades, and the impact that it is having on the masses is undeniable. Let us be clear that in its historical development, yoga is no stranger to the need of having to adapt to ever-changing social circumstances and an ever-changing world. Hatha Yoga does have its place within the grand picture of yoga, as the journey begins with the first step of asana practice. Each student initially is drawn toward Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, or Bhakti Yoga, and from the first tributary we can and should make a link into the other 4 and beyond. As carriers of the evolutionary process of yoga, we need to find an integral approach that develops all the main tributaries of yoga into a synthesized whole. Sri Aurobindo's evolutionary yoga. Is there an evolutionary yoga that will guide us through the turbulent times the world presently finds itself in? The yoga of the present and the yoga of the future is one that Sri Aurobindo, 1872 to 1950, has already synthesized, integrated, and developed for us. From my perspective, the integral yoga that Sri Aurobindo has developed is the most significant yogic advancement of the last 150 years. In Philosophic Classics, Volume 6, Asian Philosophy, Professor Rae Heimbeck writes, quote, Sri Aurobindo is believed by many to be the greatest Indian philosopher of modern times and the most accomplished yogi of the 20th century. His literary output reflects the depth of his dual education, yogic practice, and mystical experience. His collected works fill 36 volumes. Included are poetry, drama, short stories, literary criticism, political journalism, exceptional studies of Sanskrit classics, cultural essays, writings on yoga and philosophy. In the context of Indian philosophy, Sri Aurobindo's position was fully aligned with Vedanta, while calling little attention to that fact. He did not philosophize like a Vedantin. He found his system instead on a fresh reading of the Rig Veda, Upanishads, and Bhagavad Gita, rethinking the whole project from scratch. He spoke as a modern to the modern situation, rather than as a Vedantin building upon that historic tradition. His grasp of the modern milieu was at once thoroughly Indian and Western, accounting for his appeal to moderns of both cultures. His matter, life, mind, spirit schema can be traced to the Upanishads, but it smacks also of famous European debates on these subjects that occurred during his formative years. Sri Aurobindo's philosophy deserves the name integral, Purna, not only because of its non-dual view of reality, but also because of its pioneering East-West nexus." Unquote. The Integral Yoga of Sri Aurobindo. We already have a text that synthesizes all the main systems of yoga in Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga. This treatise on yoga discusses all the various systems of yoga that have been attempted, their truths and partial truths, their strengths and their weaknesses, their completenesses and lack thereof. The Synthesis of Yoga goes beyond any other text ever written about yoga. Let us see why this is so. The integral yoga that Sri Aurobindo has brought forward accepts the underlying and fundamental principles of the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Brahmanas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras, Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, Tantra Yoga, Karma Yoga, Yoga of Works, Bhakti Yoga, Yoga of Devotion, Jnana Yoga, Yoga of Knowledge, and other great philosophies of the East and the West. In the remainder of this article, all the writings that follow will be those of Sri Aurobindo. Quotations are taken from the first 4 chapters of The Synthesis of Yoga. Please give full attention to the Sri Aurobindo writings that follow, for in reading the words you will be carried into the experience of what he is describing. I have often found when reading The Synthesis of Yoga, The Life Divine, Savitri, or almost anything else he has written, that the experience of what he is describing is imprinted into the book. This is unlike any other author I have ever come across. He has brought Sat, truth, Chit, consciousness, and the force of consciousness, and Ananda, joy and bliss, down from above, and the triune nature of Satchidananda has been etched into his writings. If you take your time while reading and go very slowly, and pause and reflect during the process, it is possible that you might have a multiple level understanding of exactly what integral yoga is. Most people find Sri Aurobindo to be difficult to read, especially if you have not read him before. Some of Sri Aurobindo's sentences are long, with numerous commas and clauses, and yet he is presenting everything in perfect order and precisely as it must be presented. When reading him, take it clause by clause, rather than sentence by sentence. He is a masterful writer. Each word he uses is exactly the right word needed to express his ideas perfectly. Please also keep in mind the entirety of what this article is about, yoga past, present, and future. There is no better way to complete the article than through the writings of the Master Yogi and Master Writer, Sri Aurobindo himself. Words of Sri Aurobindo from the first 4 chapters of The Synthesis of Yoga. Sri Aurobindo says, "If we fix our regard on the central principle of the chief schools of yoga still prevalent in India, we find that they arrange themselves in an ascending order which starts from the lowest rung of the ladder, the body, and ascends to the direct contact between the individual soul and the transcendent and universal self. Hatha Yoga selects the body and the vital functionings as its instruments of perfection and realization. Its concern is with the gross body. Raja Yoga selects the mental being in its different parts as its lever power. It concentrates on the subtle body. The triple path of works, of love, and of knowledge uses some part of the mental being, will, heart, or intellect as a starting point, and seeks by its conversion to arrive at the liberating truth, beatitude, and infinity, which are the nature of the spiritual life. The synthesis we propose cannot be arrived at either by combination in mass or by successive practice. It must therefore be effected by neglecting the forms of the yogic disciplines and seizing rather on some central principle common to all, which will include and utilize in the right place and proportion their particular principles, and on some central dynamic force which is the common secret of their divergent methods and capable therefore of organizing a natural selection and combination of their varied energies and different utilities. In practice, 3 conceptions are necessary before there can be any possibility of yoga. There must be, as it were, 3 consenting parties to the effort: God, nature, and the human soul, or, in more abstract language, the transcendental, the universal, and the individual. If the individual and nature are left to themselves, the one is bound to the other and unable to exceed appreciably her lingering march. Something transcendent is needed, free from her and greater, which will act upon us and her, attracting us upward to itself and securing from her by good grace or by force her consent to the individual ascension. The method we have to pursue is to put our whole conscious being into relation and contact with the divine, and to call him in to transform our entire being into his. Thus, in a sense, God himself, the real person in us, becomes the sadhaka of the sadhana, as well as the master of the yoga, by whom the lower personality is used as the center of a divine transfiguration and the instrument of its own perfection. In psychological fact, this method translates itself into the progressive surrender of the ego with its whole field and all its apparatus to the beyond ego with its vast and incalculable but always inevitable workings. Certainly, this is no shortcut or easy sadhana. It requires a colossal faith, an absolute courage, and above all, an unflinching patience. For it implies 3 stages, of which only the last can be wholly blissful or rapid. The attempt of the ego to enter into contact with the divine, the wide, full, and therefore laborious preparation of the whole lower nature by the divine working to receive and become the higher nature, and the eventual transformation. There are 3 outstanding features of this action of the higher when it works integrally on the lower nature. In the first place, it does not act according to a fixed system and succession as in the specialized methods of yoga, but with a sort of free, scattered, and yet gradually intensive and purposeful working determined by the temperament of the individual in whom it operates, the helpful materials in which his nature offers, and the obstacles which it presents to purification and perfection. In a sense, therefore, Each man in this path has his own method of yoga. Secondly, the process being integral, accepts our nature such as it is, stands organized by our past evolution, and without rejecting anything essential, compels all to forego a divine change. Everything in us is seized by the hands of a mighty artificer and transformed into a clear image of that which it now seeks confusedly to present. In that ever-progressive experience, we begin to perceive how this lower manifestation is constituted, and that everything in it, however seemingly deformed or petty or vile, is the more or less distorted or imperfect figure of some element or action in the harmony of the divine nature. We begin to understand what the Vedic rishis meant when they spoke of the human forefathers fashioning the gods as a smith forges the crude material in his smithy. Thirdly, the divine power in us uses all life as the means of this integral yoga. Every experience in outer contact with our world environment, however trifling or however disastrous, is used for the work, and every inner experience, even to the most repellent suffering or the most humiliating fall, becomes a step on the path to perfection. And we recognize in ourselves, with opened eyes, the method of God in the world, his purpose of light in the obscure, of might in the weak and fallen, of delight in what is grievous and miserable. We see the divine method to be the same in the lower and in the higher working, only in the one it is pursued tardily and obscurely through the subconscious in nature, in the other it becomes swift and self-conscious, and the instrument confesses the hand of the master. All life is a yoga of nature seeking to manifest God within itself. Yoga marks the stage at which this effort becomes capable of self-awareness, and therefore of right completion in the individual. The widest synthesis of perfection possible to thought is the sole effort entirely worthy of those whose dedicated vision perceives that God dwells concealed in humanity.